Good morning. Years ago, I was in some gift shop somewhere and I saw a t-shirt that had a design on it that caught my attention. It was a black t-shirt, and on the design on it was a bear looking at the sky, and the black t-shirt, of course, provided the black sky. And in the sky was the Big Dipper, made up of 7 stars. And the look on the bear's face was very sweet and almost worshipful, but with a sense of love. It wasn't necessarily a cartoon bear; it was an illustration, but the picture conveyed that in a very subtle way. I thought it was interesting, but I had no idea really what the story was until just a few years ago. I heard a Native American mythology that talks about the creation of what's called Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And this rock formation, it's interesting. I've never been there personally, maybe some of you have, but I've seen pictures of it. And there's a forested area and kind of a plains area and a forested area. And then suddenly there's this huge rock edifice that just goes straight up in the air with these deep ridges going from the top to the bottom, and it stands in the air 867 feet high. And the name Devil's Tower was given to it by the Europeans who came here and set up a lot of things in our country, but the Native Americans refer to that as Bear Lodge Butte, and there's a reason for that. Once upon a time, there was a family of children, 7 girls and 1 boy, sisters and a brother. And they decided to go out one day and to play in the forest. But we have to take a closer look at these 8 children for a moment to have the story make sense. So the girls, they all had a real deep desire to be ethereal and to be part of the light and part of the heavenly wisdoms. They would look at the stars at night with wonder, and they wondered what mysteries and what medicine was contained in the night sky and the stars. And they wanted so much to be part of that and to learn that part of it. Now the brother, the boy, was very much drawn to the earthly, to the material realms, was interested in the magic and the medicine and the wisdoms of the earth, in the way that the bear teacher would find these things out, by roaming around and rooting around and allowing the earth to teach it all of its lessons. And so they're out there playing this one day, and at one point, the boy got a little bit away from the girls and was in the forest. And the forest spoke to him and said, "Would you like to become that which you seek, that which you desire in your heart?" And he was almost afraid to agree to that, but all he had to do was say yes, and he said yes. And at that moment, he turned into a bear. Well, being overcome with the energies of the bear, something he wasn't used to, in the aggression and the ferocity, he began to chase the girls in a very aggressive way, and they became afraid, and they were running around, and there was a stump in the forest, and the stump said, "Girls, if you get on top of me, I will take you away from the bear, and I will allow you to ascend to a place of your deepest desires." And so the girls said yes. And at that moment, the stump ascended into the air, up into the heavens, up into the sky. And that bear, who was desperately trying to get at the girls, tried to get them, and he clawed the sides of that stump, where today you see the claw marks on the side of Devil's Tower or the Bear Lodge Butte. And from there, the young girls in safety were able to step off into the sky, and they were able to become the stars in the sky. They were able to become the illumination and to step into the wonders of that illumination, that ethereal world. And so the T-shirt that I saw some years ago in a shop was basically the brother saying good morning or good evening to his sisters. Because the deeper meaning of the T-shirt is that in the midst of the angst that was there present when the bear was chasing the girls, in the midst of that fear and that pain and that angst, there was something coming forth. There was the highest and best of both of them. And so when the bear greeted his sisters at night, they were both thanking each other for the experience, because the bear was able to gain his wisdom and the stars were able to gain their wisdoms. This realization that we have of the way things work, that's what metaphysics is about. There are some religions that say if you can find something out, if you can go to a particular church, if you can go through a particular ceremony or a ritual of some kind, then you will get to where you're going. Metaphysics says it's already here. It's just up to us to open up to it. It's up to us to use and to understand. You see, the story of these 8 children is that they all opened up to something higher. They opened up to a greater experience, even though it was difficult, even though it was scary, even though it was challenging, even though they went through what some people call the dark night of the soul. There is something emerging on the other side. Ernest Holmes, in his work, if you look into his definitions, he talks about the word spiritual or spirituality. And we hear that word a lot in our movement. We hear it these days. I want to open up to spirituality. I want to be more spiritual. What Holmes says is that is the idea of becoming aware of what he calls the thinking of God, the mind of God. Now, what does that mean? That means that this power called God that we have within us and without us, it works in conjunction with each other. The power of God that we have within us is what brings about our passions, our desires, those things that we are looking for on a deep level, like the seven young women who want to be part of the ethereal, part of the illumination, who want to know the wisdoms of the heavens, and the boy who wants to know the wisdoms of the earth, the wisdoms of the material. Those are deep burning desires within us. That's why in religious science we like to use the word desire as opposed to what we want or what we hope for. The word desire has a deeper meaning to it. It comes from somewhere within. And so what happens to that is that this desire, this God part of us, this spirit part of us, is part of our atmosphere. And then we have the atmosphere of the universe which moves beyond our bodies, which we are all part of. It takes that desire and begins to act upon it, even though it may mean going through things that seem sort of challenging or scary at the time. You know, throughout my life, there have been times where I really like this concept that God is all there is, that I have a relationship with the oneness. But there are times where that's challenging and difficult. I have had what I would refer to as times where I have my atheism at 2 o'clock in the morning, where I toss and turn and I'm filled with anxieties, and maybe I'm filled with anger, I'm filled with sorrow, or I'm filled with question. I'm filled with a lack of understanding. I'm filled with a void. And I toss and turn and the anxieties build up in me and I can't sleep, or I can't feel close to God. And that's when Ernest Holmes said that we have to open up to this relationship, because he's talking about, in the reading that you heard this morning, the innermost God and the God Almighty is one God. So there is a relationship between the innermost God and the God Almighty. And so It is like the dance of the yin and yang, if you will. It is what is going on inside of us that becomes aligned with what's going on outside of us. Spirit says to our desires, yes, my beloved, it is done unto you. And our response is supposed to be, yes, my beloved, I allow that to come forth. But we have trouble with that. We get hung up in that. Dallas scholar William Martin says, our conditioned or ego-based material minds tell itself scary stories to keep itself stirred up and distracted. It creates problems to keep itself busy. In its way, it would never let us rest. It is the source of every fear. Our spirit mind, that's an interesting idea. Our spirit mind is silent. Thus, it is the source of the capacity or potentiality of every loving action. Spirit mind. And that's what I think Holmes is talking about when he talks about being spiritual or being open to spirituality. When he talks about the mind of God, the thinking of God, our spirit mind. To be able to move forward and recognize when an opportunity comes forward to bring into manifestation our deepest desires. Years ago, when I became a minister in Paradise, and becoming a minister was very challenging for me. There were a lot of challenges, and I did some things well, and I did some things not so well. And there was a woman named Bev who I became good friends with, and she was very supportive of me. And we kind of had some things in common. We had some common ground about us because when I knew her, she was quite a bit older than I was, but she had been a retired Vallejo police officer. And our common ground was that, first of all, we were both interested in spirituality and things like that, obviously. But the other thing is that I had worked in juvenile corrections in Solano County, where Vallejo is, which is where she was a police officer. And I'd worked a few years in a parole services job in drug and alcohol rehabilitation. And so we had that in common in the spirituality. I found Bev to be a very inspiring and very interesting lady. She seemed to have a refinement to her, and I'll explain in a moment what her refinement was. And she seemed to be incredibly intelligent, and her education seemed to be above whatever she had accomplished formally. And she was a very bright and articulate and refined lady. But the thing I liked about her was she also had some street in her too, because she'd been a cop. And I loved that part of her, that blend of she could get down and dirty and she could get down into the asphalt and the gutter and all that sort of thing. And so we would have these conversations about the type of work we did and the spiritual aspects of it. The refinement of her was that Bev had been born in the Northeast, and she grew up in a small town in New England, just above New York City, and her father was incredibly wealthy. I think he worked in the stock market or something, made lots of money. And so he had his family up there out of the city, and she was raised Catholic, and when she was a really young girl, her mother passed away, and he eventually remarried another woman. And the stepmom was someone who played an interesting role in Bev's life because she really didn't want Bev around, and Bev was an only child. And she loved her father dearly, and she missed her mother dearly. And so the stepmom says, I think that it would be best for her if we could send her to a Catholic boarding school further up in New England. So she was sent there. And when Bev went to that school, she was heartbroken to be away from her family, but she tried to make the best of it, and she worked really hard, and she received an amazing education. And that became the foundation of her refinement and her intelligence. When she became a teenager, and the hormones of being a teenager were cut loose, and people begin to look out there for partnerships and love and puppy love and whatever else there is. She looked out at the landscape and she found herself attracted to women. And being her age and being in a Catholic boarding school, that was really forbidden, but she ended up becoming attracted to a particular girl. And so they got into a very secret relationship of innocent love and connection. And so it was inevitably discovered. And the school brought it to the attention of everybody, including both children's parents. And so Bev's parents, her stepmom and her father, told her that they needed to move her to another boarding school, and the two girls were to be separated. And Bev said, "I never saw her again." And so I was talking to her, and I said, "Wow, that must have been just incredibly tragic." And she said it was. It was something that she carried in her heart. But she said it was one of the best things that happened to her. I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, that was such a traumatic event that when I ended up leaving her and never seeing her again, and I went through those feelings of that intense love and that separation and that heartbreak, I understood that that's who I was supposed to be in terms of my sexuality. At that moment, even as a teenager, it was cemented. She knew what her sexuality was. And no matter what the Catholic Church said or what her family said, she knew that's who she was. And she appreciated the fact that she didn't struggle with it the way she saw some people struggle with it. So she saw the gift in it. She saw that an innermost passion was able to come into manifestation through what had been a difficult situation. So eventually she worked her way, through school. She made it to her senior year, and her father and her stepmother said, if you don't denounce your sexuality, if you don't get off of this horrible way you're living and thinking, we are going to cut you out of your inheritance. Now, Bev was someone she could easily have not worked her whole life. That's the level of inheritance she would have gotten. But Bev understood at some level that she could not be something that she wasn't. And so about that time, a military recruiter came to the school, an all-girls school, and was telling these girls about how great it would be in the military. And that wasn't exactly a fertile field at that time for a military recruiter at an all-girls school, but whatever. And Bev was the only girl to come forward in the whole school and said, I want to go somewhere. I need to go somewhere. I need to make my own way in the world because I don't have a way in the world. And so she joined the Navy, and she was sent to the West Coast to boot camp, and then eventually she was stationed at Treasure Island in the Bay Area. She came to the San Francisco Bay Area. A girl from Catholic boarding schools, a lesbian, someone who was completely on her own. She had no backing from her family. She had no backing from her religion. She had no tribe. And as a young lesbian, she came to the San Francisco Bay Area, and she found her tribe. And she loved the Bay Area, the beauty of it, the social aspect of it, the gay culture of it in the early days. And she was able to manifest a couple of partners in her life, and eventually she went to a police academy and became a police officer. And the fact that she was a woman and she was gay, the police department was able to use her in ways to reach into that community in ways that other people couldn't. And she found it very fulfilling. So then she retired, and she had a partner, and they came to the Chico Paradise area, which is how she came up here into further Northern California, and where I ended up meeting her. And she and her partner had come to Paradise, hadn't been here very long, and her partner decided that she wanted to move on beyond the relationship, which was devastating to Bev. And at that time, they had moved up. They'd kind of been a universe of two for a while. And when Bev was left on her own, that's when she began to reach out for a spiritual community, which brought her to the Center for Spiritual Living in Paradise, which is the place I met her. And so I would say to her once again, wow, you must have been devastated by the loss of your partner. And she said, yeah, but Andy, I gained this community. I gained a larger community. I was always amazed that she could do that. Always amazed that she had this incredible vision of the larger picture. So when I got to know her really well, her health was beginning to manifest different incarnations of challenge. And she developed some issues with her lower digestion system, and she had to stay home quite a bit because, as she told me, she said, you may not see as much of me because I've developed a strong relationship with my bathroom. And so I would go over to see her, and what I found was a woman who had set up shop in her house, and she had turned her front room into, basically it was like sitting on an altar, and she was surrounded by her books and her readings and her videos and her cat, who she loved dearly. And she would go into meditation, and she would read, and she would watch things, and she was immersing herself in the deepest aspects of Hinduism, Buddhism, the Gnostics, all these ideas. And I asked her, I said, where do you think all this fits? And she said, well, ultimately, if you look at my age, I'm about ready to make another journey, and I'm preparing myself for that. This is my opportunity. Wow. So then eventually she went into skilled nursing, and I knew how much her home meant to her, and all of a sudden now she was in the middle of a bunch of chaos and nurses and other patients and roommates. And I went to go see her, and I remember walking into her room one day, and she had a smile that lit up her entire face. And I said, how are you doing? I know your home means so much to you. And she said, Andy, look at what I've manifested. Before I go, I can have community. And that was the place, that ended up being the place where she left this world. There were times I would visit her and we would talk about the fact that she was now living in her airport terminal, getting ready to go. This is knowing the relationship of the oneness. This is someone who knew and who practiced, and I really want to emphasize the idea of practice, that when I have a desire and when I open up, I have a relationship with Spirit that brings forward the highest of ideals and meets me where I am. And I was always so humbled by Bev, because I would have things come along that would knock the pins out from under me, and that's when I would be up at 2 o'clock in the morning. And Bev had the grace of someone who had a larger vision, who understood the larger picture. I work in drug and alcohol treatment in a residential facility, and we do groups there. And this last week, and Reverend Sue had given me this assignment to talk about our relationship with oneness a few weeks ago. It's been kind of in my head. And this one day, it was just this week, I was doing a group, and somehow we got on the topic of oneness, and I'm not even the one who got us there. It was the clients who got us there, about 15 people in the room. And we had one young gentleman who has just come to us recently, who is filled with anger and angst, and who is filled with depression, and is filled with shame and guilt, and all the baggage that comes from addiction, especially when you come to the end of the road. And he said, all of a sudden he blurted out, he said, I don't understand all this oneness talk. Aren't we all just separate, on our own, alone, and lonely? Isn't that just what we are? And we sat there for a moment, and another client across the room said, well, what I found here is a community of people who understand me without ever seeing me, who know my journey, and I know their journey. I'm in a community of people who are grabbing a hold of hope like I am. And in that way, in this circle, we are all one. This ability that we can have in our spiritual practices to recognize the oneness that is there. It pulls us into that relationship. It pulls us into practice. It pulls us into awareness. Thich Nhat Hanh said something when I read one time where he talks about, he said, very often when we have gone through a very difficult time, at the end of it, someone will come up to us and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. And we may say, I'm not sorry because of all the stuff I learned. And Thich Nhat Hanh says, being spiritual is recognizing that on the front end. When the garbage comes in the mail of our life, to be able to recognize, wow, this is spirit bringing forth something that matches my deepest desire. So I'd like to finish this morning, and I'd like to ask you to close your eyes if you would. I'm going to share a short piece with you in sort of a prayer meditative way, prayerful meditative way. So allowing the energies just to settle a bit. This is from William Martin, who's a Taoist scholar. He says, tranquility rests within us, softening our edges and bringing us peace. Where does it come from? Someplace we can't name. What is its source? Something inexhaustible. What does it do? Everything that needs to be done. Namaste. Thank you.